Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. In feudal societies, the lords owned the land and the serfs worked on it and paid the lords all their production as rent. In slave societies, the masters owned people and forced them to work. In capitalist societies, employers hire employees who produce more value than they are paid, and profits go to the ever increasing rich. All these systems seem to have ethical and moral problems. Who can offer some insight? Perhaps a dead German philosopher named Karl? Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings, everybody. We're here with Dr. Vanessa Wills. Very excited to have you on our podcast. And you are a philosophy professor at George Washington University.
That's
And
right.
you've got pretty good credentials. You went to Princeton for your bachelor degree and then spent some time in Pittsburgh working on your PhD, which is where Greg worked on his PhD. So you have some common interests there. And so and are you an associate or an assistant professor?
Associate, yeah. So
Okay,
recently got tenure and
they
made
have
the jump. Yeah.
they have to change your website on the
I noticed
university.
that. You're
I
right. Yeah, I
noticed
have to
that. I
tell
looked at that and I
them.
said, assistant. Did she get
Mm-hmm.
demoted? Because your book says
Right.
okay,
We know
that's
how to
good. You
fix
have to worry
her.
about people
Right.
that teach Marxism. They're always getting screwed by universities, So
It's very true.
so there you go. This is your book, Marx's Ethical Vision, and I just for you, I decided to because it was such a gray, dull background. I put your
Yeah.
image up here too. So for the book, and I said before we got on that I read your dissertation, and this is your dissertation kind of written for people that maybe not are not as completely understand philosophy at your level as as a professor of philosophy um at Georgetown. Tell me about the book. Tell me about
At
your
George Washington, rather.
George Washington. Good.
Yeah.
Tell me about your book.
So it springs out of questions that I first started asking as a graduate student. Of course, chief among them, what did Marx think about ethics, and what can a Marxist perspective tell us about these questions that so many people have? How should we treat one another? What should we do? What kind of world should we live in? Is we're at war? Is that right? Is it ethical for us to be invading, killing, maiming, right, harming? And if it's not, then how do we know? On what basis do we draw that determination? So those are some of the questions that inspired me to start the research that at this point culminates in the book. And the book itself is doing a few things. So one is to intervene on the question of whether Marx should be thought of as divided into two separate Marxes, an early Marx and a later Marx, who disagree on a number of questions, one of them being the question of morality. So it's very
Mhm.
common to say the early Marx, he's young, he's thinking about alienation and human nature and all this other frou-frou romanticism. And then he becomes this hard-nosed economic determinist, and all he cares about is commodity exchange, which now apparently has no bearing on the earlier questions. And I just thought that was mistaken. So one of the things the book does is argue for reading Marx as someone who created a body of work that forms a whole, and it has a continued kind of internal development within it. Um, I argue, first of all, of course, that he does have something to contribute to our thought about ethics, even if it is just is attending more closely to his critiques of other rival theories.
Mhm.
Often, when people deal with Marx's criticisms of other moral theories at all, they treat him as though he just said morality is ideology and that was it, whereas actually he goes on about Kant, about utilitarianism, about Malthusianism, about ethical egoism, and so on. Um, and then to say a little bit about what I think his views about ethics are in any kind of positive sense. And I argue throughout the book that that under capitalism, the content of ethics is well, contains, right,
Mhm.
the aim of uh promoting the cause of promoting human flourishing, and of allowing for the emergence of what Marx calls rich individuality, this kind of dynamic, all-sided development. But Marx does talk about the abolition of morality. And so one of the major differences between this and the dissertation, there's many of them because it's been 15 years or whatever since,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, but one of the major differences is I tackle that question more head on, of what could it really mean to talk about the abolition of morality.
Yeah. Well, Greg and I met 3 years ago during the pandemic, and actually, Greg was the first real live Marxist that I guess I uh,
Hey.
knew. And
Mhm.
our third or fourth episode, we did a summary of Marx, and that gave me a chance to read Des Capital and the Communist Manifesto. And do you remember that, Greg? That our one of our
Yeah,
very first ones. And
early on.
and and I went back and re-listened to it, and it's actually very good. It's really good. And well, we've had some bad podcasts, but that was one of our better ones. But Greg, you what struck me is you were talking about the problem with capitalism. And Vanessa, in your beginning part of your book, you just sort of laid out really simply the ethical problems with capitalism. Um, Greg, you told the story of your uncle who raised you in a coal mining town in central Illinois, making, I forget the exact amount, making just less than $1 a day for a ton of coal, and a ton of coal would sell for $60. Or tell me about that. Do you remember?
Yeah, I actually had some of his old pay stubs from the 20s,
Wow.
30s, and 40s. In fact, I wrote about it in an article. I have one of those stubs embedded in that article. But you could look at how much tonnage he dug, and then you could look at how much he was paid. And if you cared enough to go back and see what coal sold for at that time, you could get a kind of very rough but a crude idea of what exploitation was. And I think
Mhm.
the coal face is interesting because probably that's the one place where the worker boss interaction is so demonstrative of exploitation, of what
Mhm.
exploitation is. It gets
Mhm.
lost in a big industrial plant, it gets lost in the service sector. But at the coal face, when you go down in a hole and you dig the coal and you put it into a little truck. It goes out, it's weighed, and you're paid accordingly. And it's resold after a small process. That gives you a really good sense of what exploitation was. And that's always been my view that at the heart of Marxism,
Mhm.
mature Marxism is exploitation. That's
Mhm.
the key concept. And then in terms of Vanessa's discussion, the question then becomes, is that an ethical term or is it
Mhm.
strictly a technical term in Marxism? And that's another way of looking at this
Mhm.
issue of
Mhm.
whether
Mhm.
Marx was an ethicist or whether he was just a political economist or whether there's some blend of the two. But yeah, we had that conversation, and
Mhm.
I always go back to that. When I was in graduate school at Pitt, I had a similar um, epiphany, Paul on the road to
Mhm.
Damascus. I wasn't that political before that, and I
Mhm.
got involved
Mhm.
with communists and the Communist
Interesting.
Party.
Yeah. Mhm.
But I'd read a lot, and I thought I knew a lot about Marxism. And then I was invited to attend a class led by an old ex-coal miner, Communist Party
Wow.
class led by an ex-coal miner. And I
Wow.
thought, oh, Christ, what is he going to tell? I mean, I know about chapter one of Capital by heart almost. And well, I learned a lot from him because again, at the coal face, you have a really clearer picture, a deep dive into what capitalism is. And so I always appreciated that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's and I like that, as you said in your just a little bit ago, that Marx was there was the young part of the idealistic Marx, and then he be the scientific part of him at
Right.
the end
These
of his.
like two different Marxes and
But the theme running through it is a problem of whether or not people are being exploited. You obviously were exploited in feudal time because you worked for the king. The king did everything, protected you, but you just everything went to the king. Slavery, was just you own people, made them work, made money. But the simple features of capitalism, which is you are uh, hired by somebody who pays you, who then ends up having profits from your work and increasingly gets wealthier and wealthier and wealthier at your expense. All three of those systems, if you just went back, you could say, wait a second, there's some ethical problems with how we're organizing things here. And I think that was what, that's clear in your book of going through what some of those problems are, alienation and so forth.
yeah. Yeah. My in my book I focus a lot of attention on the concept of alienation in particular. I I wonder if this is a point of disagreement. I'm not sure. I tend to think of exploitation as a descriptive term. And to think that then to flesh out the normative story, we need the concept of alienation, and we need a concept of uh, what what one is alienated from, namely human nature, understood as our own active engagement in the natural and social world to satisfy our needs, an engagement and activity that then is the process through which we produce ourselves. Um, but there's, of course, a very close connection between exploitation and alienation, right? Because exactly, Greg, as you stated with the example of the coal miner, you can literally see there is my labor, and it's all on the other side with that guy. It's not with me, right? So it's, I think, we see exploitation there, and we also importantly see in full relief the alienation, right? Like all of my energy and endeavor is now arrayed against me as my enemy. And then the question is, how do I reclaim it, right? In and this is also, I think, where it's impossible to make sense of what Marx is saying without thinking about dialectics. And in this little model, right, that we're describing, imagine the coal miner and their boss. Um, how having an approach to ethics that allows you to see that the mere abstract appeal to ethical ideals is not going to solve the problem of achieving a reconciliation between the worker and the boss. We can sing songs all day. I can see the humanity in the boss all day. I can try to give the boss all kinds of moral education. But ultimately, the only thing that is actually going to produce that reconciliation of myself with my own products, my own activity, is actually a conflict and a willingness not to shy away from that conflict. And it's only through conflict, engaging in it in an active way with a conscious awareness of the conflict and of my role in it, that I can ever hope to have a world in which I and that person, or much more likely some other person, but a world where people do not stand to one another in this hostile, antagonistic relation. So the sort of human reconciliation that is aimed at as an ethical ideal in Kantian morality, in Christian morality, is taken out of the realm of mere theory and hope and turned into a plan, but a plan that requires that we not jump the gun, right? With that reconciliatory moment, and actually do the work of truly making it the case that I am reunited with myself.
When I look back at our number 4 podcast on Marxism, I think, Greg, you brought up the issue of Marx's famous quote on religion and how it's often misinterpreted. Let me read that to you, and then both of you chat about it. Religion is the opiate of the people. That's what we typically think. It is the sigh of the oppressed creatures, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of our soulless conditions. So we often look at that first statement, oh, it's the opiate of the people. No, these stupid people are using religion as an escape. And yet the most important part is the second part of that. It is the sigh of the oppressed. Talk about that, Greg and Vanessa. What do you feel about that related to Christianity?
I would also, I
it's,
would also, oh, sorry.
oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
Vanessa.
I would also just note that first part. I mean, I've had a few surgeries in the past couple years, and what I wanted when I woke up was opiates.
Greg, you
Right?
had that. Greg had knee surgery. He had knee surgery.
Right?
I'm a stoic. I don't look for opiates. No. It's Vanessa.
And well, I did, and
Sure.
and
Sure.
so I think even that first line, when we talk about the opiate of the people, opiates are an medical advance, but unfortunately they can be used and abused, and one of the ways that they can be used and abused is to pacify a population, right? I mean, we actually see it quite literally. So I wrote an article about Marx's atheism a few years back, and there one of the things I point out is that we have the literal version of this in our day, just like Marx did in his. We have a heroin crisis across the US. And why? Because people are miserable. Well, two reasons. One, they're miserable. Two, they have terrible health care or none. So in that instance, opiates are outstripping their appropriate use and being used instead to cover over the tensions, contradictions, and horrors of capitalist society. So whenever people take this line and treat it like a gotcha moment, like, aha, it's just there's no way to do that and not be completely disingenuous, because it's not like you don't understand the metaphor. This is still our present world that Marx is describing in that line.
Yeah, and for the second part, on the second part, that certainly is an ethical statement. I mean, that's certainly a dramatic expression of an ethical opinion or view, what Marx is saying there. There's no question in that regard. Marx has an ethics. He's not above ethics in that regard. He's really lashing out at, not lashing out, but he's defending in an emotional way. He's defending a religion. But yeah, but that's typical of Marxism, isn't it? I mean, it takes a phenomena and it doesn't treat it in a simplified or a simplistic way. It talks about how it functions, its role, and how it accomplishes something. At the same time, he was an atheist. He didn't believe in God, but he can understand what that can be.
So I have unorthodox view, I guess. It's not that far from the orthodox
Unorthodox
view.
or orthodox?
Unorthodox, although it's not so very far from the orthodox view. So I actually argue that Marx was not an atheist. And
Oh,
my
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
so there's numerous cases where he distances himself from atheism, right? He says in one of his letters, I wish that we could have less trifle with the atheists who are like children telling anyone who will listen that they don't believe in God, right? And he's very, very critical. And what I argue is that Marx's perspective on God and religion is better understood as what I call radical irreligion, because he not only thinks that belief in God is absurd, he also thinks even treating the question as coherent is mistaken. That the question, does God exist, already presupposes that it's possible to have answers about objects that we have no way of ever interacting with, that could never be entered into the kind of materialist exchange and interaction that is the basis of his epistemology for human beings, that we know the world through interacting with it. And a kind of spiritual being like God is like a great candidate for the sort of thing that we could never do that with, and that therefore even the question is incoherent and should be rejected. So as I say, it's a little bit of a twist, but it's not like, don't
it's
worry, I'm not
irrelevant.
saying that he was actually a a hardcore Bible thumper at all,
He's not a
as it
Bible
all
thumper.
turns out.
Well,
But it says that it's irrelevant, correct? I mean, he's
Right,
essentially
yeah,
saying that the question is
I'm
irrelevant. It's almost like a
because
modern analytical philosopher, which
a
we
little
both know so
bit,
well. In a sense,
yeah,
it's sort of like a nonsensical question. It's ill-formed, an ill-formed question, the
yeah.
way a logician would put it.
Yeah, and he's trying to
Interesting.
distance himself from the most prominent atheists of his time, right? Who are people like the Bauer brothers and so on. And he's
Bill
just
Bauer.
saying, yeah, this is a little bit. I mean, it reminds me they're less prominent today, thank goodness. But the new atheists that make me so incredibly ashamed to like be an atheist. Because my views are much more similar to Catholic social justice organizers that I've known than they are to the new atheists,
Well, that kind
and
of
so
attitude isn't going
yeah.
to get you very
Mhm.
far as a Jesuit priest in Central America. That's all I can say. Yeah, well, I'm thinking about his Judaism.
Mhm.
So all of his family were rabbis, all of his grandparents and so forth. So there, and his father converted from Judaism to Catholicism because in Germany, as in a lot of parts, the Jews couldn't run businesses. They were controlled
Right,
by the state. If you look at it depends on what country you were in, but some of them they just literally were discriminated against very
right.
clearly. And I think that was the case of his father in Germany. So you have the issue of religion and being a Jew and that tradition against the broader issue of the state screwing you
Right.
because you're being categorized as this one type of person that they can use to exploit. I don't know. It seems like he couldn't just have walked away from all of that, seeing how remarkably harmed his family was by the anti-Semitism of
I
of
think you
of the
see
time.
him, yeah, I think one of the places that you see him responding to the facts that you just described is in On the Jewish Question, where he's arguing that socialists absolutely should be supportive of Jewish people's struggles to be free from the various kinds of limitations and forms of repression that are placed on them by the state. I mean, that text is often misunderstood or or willfully misread. But the main upshot of the text is criticizing the abstentionism of others in his milieu who are saying, well, why do this? Aren't they just advocating for religion? We're atheists. And Marx is saying, you sound dumb. The state is depriving people of their liberties, of their rights. The state is creating this hierarchy, and it is our role to fight against that and to fight alongside people who are struggling against being repressed in this way. And then argues, I think beautifully that anyway, the atheists are not all that atheistic and have quite a religious and credulous relationship to the state itself, which is like a brilliant move, right? And this is also a piece of what I capture in that notion of his radical irreligion, right? Because for him, the point is not just to stop believing in God; it is to actually stop being religious. And on the Jewish question, he talks about the religiosity of the market, of believing in the invisible hand, the religiosity of accepting that citizens are free when the actual human beings are not. I mean, there's so much good stuff in that
Right,
text,
right.
and exactly him grappling with those questions.
And you said something about you're kind of turned off with the new atheists. Is that, Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and
Yeah.
not even Daniel Dennett? Come on. Daniel
I
Dennett?
just I find
It's
them
a brother
trite.
philosopher.
And
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I listen, I don't want to bash anybody, but I find them very uninspiring. I find the atheism of the new atheists uninspiring, and suspiciously similar to the Christianity
Yeah,
of the
right. The
evangelicals
ri
when it comes
rigidity.
to the
Yeah,
most important questions of the day.
right.
Like, for example, um, imperialism being chief among them. So you would think that this might be a cause for reevaluation, but it's not really for any of the leaders in that milieu.
Yeah, Sam
Oh, yeah, I
Harris
mean,
has literally gone off the rails. I don't know if you followed him recently, but he is
I
just,
haven't.
oh God, he is just, I mean, I've read all of his stuff, Moral Landscape, Free Will, and but
it's not,
his support of the Gaza genocide is just, it's
But it flows
unreal.
exactly from everything he's ever,
Yeah,
I mean,
like you
and
said, that
even,
rigidity.
yeah,
Greg,
and yeah.
Greg, jump
well,
in. What were you going to say?
it serves no useful political purpose. I mean, militant atheism now, what's the point of it? I mean, I'm more interested actually in Francis, because Francis's views are closer to Marx's views than probably any public speaker, any important, significant, major speaker in the world today.
Although
And
Francis
I
has
don't
his
care what he
problems.
believes, huh?
Although he's got his problems.
Well, he's got problems, he
Yeah.
does, but on questions of social justice, many questions of social justice that are untouched by most leaders, he's out front on it. Sure, I mean, he's not a communist,
You're not gonna,
not a
yeah.
Marxist, but I don't hold Marxist and communist standards to everybody, or I would be living by myself in a hole somewhere. But no, but I mean, I think there's something interesting about religion, and I think people that are religious, a portion of them find their way into progressive politics,
Hmm.
and an important portion. I mean, they end up often being certainly in Judaism. Judaism in this country, the Jewish immigrants to this country were a huge part of the Marxist, communist, socialist movement in its early years. Just that's what it was.
Civil rights.
And so these have been generated by cultural religion, maybe not believing in God per se. I don't see any direct link between believing in socialism and believing in God, but certainly the culture of the churches at synagogues and so on have created a view of humanity that Vanessa's talked about already that makes people, pushes them in the direction of progressive politics.
Right.
I talk a little bit about this in the book, thinking about the question of whether uh, believing in religion makes you not a Marxist. And because this comes up in a work of Terry Eagleton's, talking about this notion that, well, you can be religious and be materialist in Marx's sense. And I say, I don't think you can be materialist in Marx's sense, but in a slightly broader context, do I want to say that there aren't Christian Marxists and Muslim Marxists and Jewish Marxists? And so, I mean, that just seems absurd. And for the reason you just mentioned, Greg, you can't be so sort of doctrinaire about these things. People are drawn to socialist movements and do amazing work. And I point out that, by the way, their views oftentimes have much more in common with Marx than some of the self-professed atheists. So,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know, what is it that I actually care about in that case?
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, I want to get back to your book and why you got into moral philosophy. You stated that, oh, when was the Iraq War? 2000
They
something,
invaded in
2003.
2003. Yeah.
2003. And you and I, and I'm assuming Greg, you were, boy, I went to the street. Tacoma was just full. There, it was the, I think I'm correct. It's the largest anti-war protest in history. 36 million people across the world were protesting. And I felt such, I felt such pride, and by gosh, we're gonna stop this. Nothing. Didn't affect anything. Didn't stop anything. The five defense contractors in DC are richer than ever. The war went on. Our imperialism went unabated. Um, and I think that's what you said in your book. You got involved with this, trying to make sense of what is going on here when
Yeah.
we're doing an obvious war crime of invading
Right.
Iraq. It's so clear, and it was hurtful to you, and it was confusing, and you
Yeah.
decided to study it, correct?
Yeah, I love that way of putting it, because that's exactly right. That it was hurtful. It was hurtful to me. I was like a youngin, and I was just like, I don't understand. Why are the grown-ups doing this? Like, this is bad. That's really how it felt. And
Mhm.
uh yeah, something that, just as you said, is obvious war crime, and also just misguided, even by, I mean, it just seemed, from that point, it seemed so obvious to me that the only predictable outcome would be that the world would be plunged more and more deeply into strife, disorder, and suffering. And I'm sure all three of us can attest to how like heartrending it is to be right about something like that. Um, and I I would, of course, have loved it if things had happened in the last 20 years to show me that actually human freedom, human life, I mean, human life, period, is compatible with capitalism. It would make my life easier, right? It's all
Mhm.
sorts of ways. But that's just not the case. It's Everything has unfolded in ways that show how the die was cast in a certain way by the defeat. I wouldn't say by the initial invasion in Iraq, but certainly by the defeat of the anti-war movement. it also really, and I think I talk less about this um in the book, but it also was a really fast education about the role of the Democratic Party. And there too, it would be great if in the years since the party had done things to make me think, oh, I was wrong. They're not the graveyard of everything good, but every of all of our emancipatory dreams. But time and time again, they are, and they're proving it again now.
Mhm.
And so doing that work of being part of the anti-war movement, of helping to build the anti-war movement in my town, which was Pittsburgh at that time, and then watching it be dismantled and smashed to smithereens to make sure it would never rise again, was in I would say infuriating, but I didn't feel fury. I felt and still feel I don't know, maybe I'm sort of what's the word? There's a word for like when you're having a feeling but you can't really be in touch with it. Like I don't know. Like
Denial.
not denial. It'll come to me.
Okay.
Alienated,
But
use your word, alienated.
yeah, alienated maybe. I don't know. Like but it's just horrifying. It's just a horrifying thing that I think I'm still in some ways,
So you
grappling with because it's still going on.
and your work does such a good that's good job of drawing these direct lines, and it's not a book about an old dead German, it's about right
Yeah,
now.
thank
It's
you.
about right now. Afghanistan, 18 years. What did we accomplish?
Right.
We took almost 95% of all of the money spent in Afghanistan went to one of four major defense contractors in Washington, D.C. You know, and is it any better? Is it no?
No.
Anyway, the point
Hmm.
being that there are some obvious relationships between the problems of capital and capitalism that Marx talked about that are
Yes.
fulfilling the prophecy to this
Hmm.
day.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I
Well,
don't know.
we live in a country that's sort of allergic to theory. I mean, when I look at your book,
Hmm.
I ask myself, do I recommend this to everybody? Well, unfortunately, in this country, you can't because people are allergic to theory.
Recommend
You
it to everybody you know.
Well, you know I will, Vanessa. You know I
Oprah's
will.
book
I'm
club.
going to buy
Get it
10
on
copies
Oprah's
and give
book
them
club.
away. But what I wanted to say was, but that's part of the problem is that people are they want simple answers. They don't want to dig deeper. And when you do dig deeper, you find answers. Whereas you're not just frustrated with the way things are going. I was standing on
Hmm.
a street corner in February of 2022 with 12 other people with signs saying no war in Ukraine. Well,
Hmm.
on Thursday of that week, there was war in Ukraine. It was an invasion.
Hmm.
So you know the frustration of it, but it's because people don't have an understanding. And unfortunately, an understanding is not easy. It's not transparent. It's not in a comic book form that you can present to somebody. So, yes, they have to read. People have to read and they have to go theoretically deeper. In Europe, there's more of that. I mean, I know I relate to more theoretical journals and discussions there than I do in this country. But it's essential that a book like yours, which covers a host of it, it's not just about ethics, it's about the
Right.
history of analytical Marxism, which is a critical factor in the way people think in this country about politics. It goes into dialectics and what that means as opposed to other ways of viewing things, which is a critical factor in coming to grips with Marx.
Mhm.
It goes into the other ethical theoreticians that those of us that were studied philosophy grew up on and how Marx
Right.
is different from that. All of these things are part of coming to understand how your world works. And I just wish there was an easier way to get people to understand that and dig in.
I
So the
appreciate
book
that
is
so much.
important.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much because the book was hard to write, and it's like and it's precisely because it does, you can't talk about, I mean, this is also one of the arguments I give early on for why we cannot just brush this question aside. And it's because once you look at Marx through this lens, it helps you to see the whole of his theory, and it sheds light on it that other lenses don't, although those are also necessary. You know, we need Marx as an economist, we need Marx as a sociologist, we need Marx as all of these things, but we also need Marx's contribution, Marx, what should be, I think, Marx's obvious contribution to this basic question: how ought human beings to live?
And that gets to alienation and the problem of alienation. Um, when I was working a few years ago, I would do the healthy youth survey at the high school and junior high schools where you'd ask kids about alcohol use, smoking, so forth. And you'd see certain trends. Smoking's actually going down, vape is going
Yeah.
up, drug use is going down. You know, you'd see some really positive trends. One of the most shocking trends was the trends of depression and suicidal ideation. And you could blame it on smartphones or, whatever, but it is true that, and especially after the pandemic, the
Hmm.
the emotional health of many of our young adolescents is problematic. And when I look at it, these issues, a lot of that can be blamed to the problems of capitalism.
Oh
These
yeah.
parents are working multiple jobs. In poverty, there's a huge number of families that are single parents based on the dynamics. The gig work, and even within the high tech world, the problem of layoffs, the problems of mass layoffs, and by the cyclical nature of capitalism, we have 2008. I'm talking too much, but I'll make my point. We made 2008. We have a horrible depression or recession that occurred, and who wins? You can't buy a house now because of the capitalists coming in and buying the price of homes. The transfer of wealth going to smaller group of people is continually unabated. The destruction of the unions. All of these things are contributing to a psychological feeling of anxiety, depression, hopelessness, uh, and I can point to the person I think is responsible for that, or the event, or the economic system that I think is responsible for
I
that.
was about to say, I was like, who is it?
Who is the
Like,
person?
let's find them.
Yeah, the person's the boogeyman,
Right.
right? Yeah, I don't know. That's, I mean, am I histrionic, or did
No,
that kind of capture some of the things you're trying to express in
well,
your book, or
it
both?
does. No, yeah, right. That's true. Two things can be true. Um, no, I think that's right. And I think that there's sometimes a hesitation to talk about emotions and to talk about the way that capitalism feels. And I understand the hesitation. I think it's not an entirely um, uncalled for hesitation, because you don't want to flee into sort of mere emotionalism. But on the other hand, people are suffering. People are subjectively experiencing great distress. And any approach that claims to have answers about what we ought to do, about what the future can be like, about what a desirable alternative might be, cannot gain any purchase, and shouldn't, doesn't deserve to gain purchase unless it speaks to that, unless it speaks to what people are experiencing, including on that emotional, affective level.
At the end of your book, you talk about Angela Davis. We read her autobiography and tried to get her on, and she didn't re she didn't agree. So
That's a very busy lady.
she did get back to me. So she's on my shit list.
Oh,
But
really? Is that all it takes?
yeah, so on my shit list. Greg, though, I think Greg, you've sent me a lot of articles about her sort of going off the rails a bit with her activism. I don't know. What do you want to talk bad about Angela Davis, Greg, or do you just want to?
No, I mean, she, like Marx, she has a history. There's a
Right.
young Angela, there's a middle
Mhm.
Angela, and a late Angela. And I knew her. I mean, I knew her. We weren't friends, but I mean, I worked security when she was in Pittsburgh. Um, I met her at Communist Party, or I saw her at Communist Party um, conventions. I
Mhm.
saw her in the '91 convention, which was so explosive. We had this conversation with Gerald Horne. Gerald Horne has a
Mhm.
particular
Oh, yeah.
view of that '91 convention, which is sort of one-sided because he wasn't there. I was there, of a different view. But her trajectory is interesting. But like so many people, she got very comfortable after she was a revolutionary. She got very comfortable in terms of being a public celebrity, a public figure.
Mhm.
And but she's played an incredibly great role through all of
Mhm.
that. It's the old Brechtian
Mhm.
thing about, you work hard for a day, you serve the public for a day, for a month, for a year. A lifetime is essential. She's always been with the people in that sense. I think it's very regrettable, and this goes to what Pat's talking about, that she now is endorsing the Democratic Party. I think that's not only regrettable, I think it's a little bit shameful. But that doesn't detract from her history and trajectory,
Right.
what she did, what she's done in the past. I remember being in Wilmington, North Carolina, the North Carolina Wilmington 10. Ben Chavis was the leader of that. They were all going to go to jail. And she spoke there. I have tears rolling down my cheeks. I mean, she's a
Mhm.
powerful, powerful speaker. So I'm not about personalities. When I was younger, I was infatuated. I'm not infatuated anymore. She's a real person.
Hard
She's got
not
her.
to be infatuated with
Oh,
Angela Davis. That's
No,
I had her
no,
poster
no,
up in
no,
my
no,
dorm
no.
room, Greg.
I
I don't know
shoot.
what
I
that.
shoot younger these days. I'm
Oh.
aiming younger. Infatuation.
Well,
I
you really do a tribute to her at the end of your book,
yeah,
and it really makes me feel good because so many people have paid a price for telling the truth, just a horrible price.
exactly. Yeah.
Tell us
I
a little bit
But
about
but
that.
maybe I didn't
yeah.
finish then. I mean, she paid a horrible price then when she was a communist, when she was a member of the Communist Party. But after she was relieved of that burden, she hasn't paid a price. I mean, she's a celebrity.
Oh,
She's a
Greg, you're
French
grouchy old
professor.
grumpy guy. Come
No, I mean,
on.
that's the
Well, I
reality.
mean,
She
it's
did
not
not
so
back
long.
down at all when Reagan was going crazy, and she stuck with her. I mean,
Well,
she
even more
I
recently,
just said when
it
she
was
was a
maybe
communist.
6 years ago, I think, that she was. I mean, she's still being denied invitations and prizes on the basis of her pro-Palestinian
just
stance.
recent. Yeah, just
And
recently.
yeah, I mean, so there are prices that she continues to pay. But more to the point, I mean, my assessment of hers is quite close to yours, Greg. I don't support the Democratic Party, and I think it's a real disservice when people do sort of promote them. But that to me is like, as foibles go, I think overall, the incredible contributions that she has made and continues to make, especially most recently with her abolitionist writings and stance that were so important to some of the theory that was infused in the Black Lives Matter
Mhm.
activism of 2020. And I I I wrote that coda. I called it coda, and I didn't know it wasn't part of the initial plan for the book. And then I it just the book felt incomplete without it. And I it's there for many reasons, but one of them is to really give a concrete example and tell a story that a lot of people actually don't know,
Right.
don't actually understand the ins and outs of what happened. And we're talking of course about Angela Davis's the multiple attempts to relieve her of her post from UCLA in the 60s, in the late 60s when she was there. And which were ultimately successful, right? She was removed from her post. And lots of people don't know that history. And certainly, and then those who do know it think, oh, well, that's just some weird one-off thing, So first of all, let's use the work of people who have written about the effects of McCarthyism on academic philosophy, and show that this was just, I mean, if anything, Davis was distinguished in actually having the ability to fight back.
Hmm.
But many, many other people just quietly disappeared, out of the academy. And it happened on a wide scale. And it's one of the reasons for the conservatism of the academy. And it's happening again today. And what's incredible is it's happening again today, and it's not the 60s.
Right.
The movements that we have are embryonic compared to the mass movements of the 1960s. So the fact that we're seeing this real movement with the anti-woke legislature in the South, and then this year, everybody at an elite university who came back to campus found that the administration had new revisions to the campus speech policy after the protests of the spring. So
Right.
it's
Yeah,
spreading.
and who have we had on, Greg, that have been part of this? Tony Montero
Mhm.
lost his job because of his
Yeah.
political. Roger
Well,
Caron,
He was
the one
called
of,
an apparatchik
yeah,
in an
yeah.
yeah,
official,
Tony, yeah.
yeah.
And this is a wonderful person. I mean, I stream his Saturday school things. He's a remarkable guy and a real intellectual. And
By the way, when he was working on his dissertation, he was writing about analytical Marxism. That was his bête noire. He wrote, I have some of the early drafts
I
of it.
didn't realize that.
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
never read
yeah, he
the
was. I
yeah.
didn't have a chance to ask him when we had him on, but I still have a copy. The old-fashioned copy that he had of a preliminary draft. But yeah, he was quite, and he was in the Communist Party in the old days. He was a prominent person there, and through the convention, through that split in '91, knew Angela Wells. So yeah, him and of course Horn's been involved around the Communist Party for forever,
right.
and he's a prolific writer, great writer.
Yeah.
Well,
But you're right, Vanessa. I mean, the persecution of academics go way back. But then
Hmm.
there was a huge flight away from Marxism, certainly after in the '90s and the '80s and early '90s. I mean, Reaganism.
Hmm.
It was an interesting thing that it was fashionable in the '70s to be a Marxist in academia. It was still fashionable into the '70s, even into the '80s, and it became unfashionable,
Right.
and most of the people rejected it. But it's
Right.
exciting to see it returning again in
There's
academia.
a
bringing
resurgence.
it back to
Yeah.
life. Like I said,
Yeah.
this is not an old history. This is a current affairs book. That's
I appreciate you saying that so much. It's one of the things that was really important to me in
yeah,
writing the book, was that it not just be a museum piece, that
right,
I really help people see how these things connect to to today, because that's how I got interested in Marxism. I
right,
didn't learn about Marx in a university seminar. I was doing activism and then was drawn to these ideas. And so that's how I want to present it to people.
right. That sounds like you, Greg, in a way. Hey,
Must have been something in the water in Pittsburgh.
in
Right,
It
Pittsburgh.
wasn't the
something going on
professor. If
there.
it wasn't the professor.
Pittsburgh does have like a lot of it's like little Madison, Wisconsin of the the East Coast in a way. Yeah. Hey, you're a singer. You're a good
Oh
singer.
yeah, I
Oh,
do
you're not a
amateur
singer.
singer.
I
This
Google
Vanessa,
our guest, and all of a sudden I get this jazz singer, and I'm going,
this
what
Vanessa
the
Wilson is a singer. How come I didn't
huh?
know that?
I do,
She's good,
I didn't
I
know
do
Greg.
that.
some
She's
amateur
good.
singing. I do a duet with my friend Femi Taiwo on one of his albums.
I'm gonna
Is it
link
on
to that.
YouTube? Is it
That
on
is
YouTube?
Yeah, it's on
phenomenal.
my
Oh,
YouTube channel actually. I
okay,
have a little
I'm gonna
music
link to that
playlist.
because it
It's
just
good.
anyway, yeah, Femi, that one.
Have you seen the new song, the new release by uh, Rhiannon Giddens about it's a Peggy
Oh
Seeger
no.
song?
I
Oh,
love
it's a brilliant
Rhiannon
song.
Giddens.
It's
Yeah.
how I long for peace. It's political. It's super political.
Okay.
Yeah, you
I'll
got to
check
check
that
it
out. I
out.
love her.
Yeah, I do
Do
too.
you sing at open mics or anything, or go, or do you just
I mean, the last time I sang in public has been, I think it's before the pandemic, aside from karaoke. Um, it's been since before the pandemic, but it's so interesting you bring this up because I actually have in recent months been practicing more at home. I'd sort of fallen out of practice, and I've just been doing more to get my voice back into shape. And so, who knows? You might hear me do something else soon, or
oh,
post
good.
another, if nothing else, post another video of myself with my guitar.
Yeah. Well, you're remarkable. I just thought, what this is coming out of nowhere.
You're like, I thought she was the
That
philosopher.
Good.
Like,
I don't
Chad
want
does
you
his
to quit your
research.
day job. Yeah.
right, yeah.
Hey, we're gonna let you go, Vanessa. This has just been so much fun. I learned so much from your book,
That makes me so
and
happy.
I just hope people pick it up. And one last thing: you're a professor, and you had to switch around schedule because you had class when then we normally do
Right.
schedule. And I did this just for you. It's
Hey, nice.
double entendre. It's class.
You really, there's a lot of artistry that went into your background here.
We go the extra mile in this
Yeah.
podcast.
All
We
right.
don't just call it
Right.
in. I'll tell you that.
Right.
That took me 5 minutes to put this screen together behind me. So anyway, okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for having
Thanks for
me.
joining us. Thanks for
All right.
joining us.
Thank you.